Well, good evening, trustees and staff members who are available and online. It's my pleasure to call this meeting to order of May 27th, 2020. And I will proceed to, I would ask the director to take a roll call, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, trustees. This is our roll call for our public session, virtual, for May 27th, 2020. Trustee Barry.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Cram.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Jacobs.
Present.
Thank you. Vice Chair McPherson.
Present.
Thank you. Chair McAllister.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee McCray.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Swan.
Present.
Thank you. Student Trustee Colton Kelford.
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, you have quorum.
Thank you, Director. I will now move to item 501, which is the consent agenda items. A motion moved by Trustee Barry, seconded by Trustee Cram, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve consent agenda items 5.02 to 5.04, May 27, 2020, as submitted. Please cast your ballot.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you, Lisa. 601, are there any conflict of interest declarations? Seeing none, I will move to 801. Director, would you have any comments to make?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do. Good evening, trustees again. My pleasure to bring forward a couple of comments and updates for you. Trustees will know that this is the usual time of year when principal and vice principal appointments and transfers for our elementary and secondary schools takes place. Knowing that we're dealing with a very unusual set of circumstances this year, senior staff are making every effort to make sure that any transfers or appointments are done to an absolute minimum to ensure continuity for our schools for the fall 2020 school year. Trustees who have experienced any kind of changes to the principal or vice principal assignments in their ward would have already heard from senior staff. And these changes or transfers or moves, Mr. Chair, were related specifically and restricted only to where there have been retirements. And as a result, we've had an obligation to fill those vacancies. As well, Mr. Chair, I'm sure you'll hear this evening from our student trustee, Colton Kelford, that we have a virtual Student Senate meeting this Friday, 30th of May. We're looking forward to trialing this format with our student senators, and again, getting a good sense of how Microsoft Teams, which is a platform that we're trying to trial at this time and get some feedback about its user-friendly nature and the user experience. That we hope that we'll also get some feedback from our students about using that method as well. I should mention as well, Mr. Chair, that trustees who are aware of the Student Senate agenda will know that one of the topics is a student voice survey, and we're asking specific feedback from our students around the distance learning experience, and we look forward to collecting those insights for the purposes of bettering our approach to whatever we're doing to serve students through distance learning at this time. Another item, Mr. Chair, that I wanted to highlight for trustees, because this is a very long-standing and certainly welcomed ceremony, is that trustees will know that each June we hold our award ceremonies for volunteers, Director of Merit Awards, and our Service Excellence Awards. Because of the pandemic, Mr. Chair, we certainly are not in a position to hold that in our usual face-to-face location in Kemptville. However, staff are looking at alternative measures that we can pursue in the next few weeks to make sure that the award recipients are acknowledged and celebrated for all the good things that they've done on behalf of our schools and our students. More to come on that as well, Mr. Chair. Lastly, tonight's reports, Mr. Chair, one of the pieces being brought forward is a comment regarding the parent survey findings. I look forward to going into a bit of a deeper dive on that for the trustee table this evening, and to share with you the findings that we had, and as well some other operational items that we're focusing on in terms of helping to manage the school system during this unprecedented and unusual time, and that will be contained in tonight's report that you'll receive from staff. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn this back over to you, but I appreciate the opportunity to flag these for the members of the board.
Thank you, Director. I only have comments in three areas. One is with an email that I shared with OPS President Kathy Abram about the serious need for a post-COVID forum involving all chairs and by extension all trustees. It concerns the transition to reopening of schools, the new normal in program delivery, and the signal to the province, to the provincial government, that we have a vested interest in the success of distance learning and in the smooth transition of our students back to school. I volunteered to initiate the organization and agenda development for this inaugural meeting so that we can influence ministry policy and the allocation of additional resources that school boards may need to function fully in what will be a revised mandate. President Kathy has responded in the affirmative, recognizing this need. She has lobbied the minister, Minister Lecce, to include chairs and boards as the governors of public education. And Kathy did say that she would place this idea on the agenda for the Executive Council, which was held late last week. And the minister has had two meetings with chairs, which I attended along with the Vice Chair McPherson. A third meeting was held this past Friday, which Vice Chair McPherson and Director Sliwa attended. So I'm going to turn this over to Vice Chair McPherson. Bill, if he would like to make any comment on that meeting.
Thank you. The one thing that I got out of this, there's a fair degree of uncertainty ahead of us. Basically, they are talking about doing the consultation. Some of the questions, they open it up. I would say about 40% of the meeting was actually two-way conversations between board chairs and the minister. There was a question about testing for positivity or negativity of teachers and staff. Student screening was another issue that came up. Another chair asked, are school boards going to be engaged or consulted before they make any announcement at the end of June as to what September is going to look like? Consultation of the local board was mentioned by several chairs. Another hot button issue was the delays in the GSMs, which I'm sure we share. They also asked about specialized funding for COVID-related issues. Again, I believe it was they want information ahead of the time so that they're not reading about it on Facebook or Instagram before the boards are making the announcements. There was a question about what happens if parents go back to work and our child care system is not quite up to speed yet. And then another question was about what about our vulnerable children that can be up to 21 years of age? What about support and relief for these very specialized students? Lynn Scott, Toronto District School Board, question about what's transportation going to look like? What is staffing going to look like? What about our capital budget? Where are they going? And again, the emphasis was to expedite these decisions. The one thing that I came out of it with was that some boards are going to face more challenging circumstances than others. For instance, a rural board with a fair number of underutilized schools can fairly easily accommodate social distancing in those schools. If you have an overcrowded urban school with 22 portables behind in the parking lot, it's an entirely different scenario. Anyways, I want to thank John for allowing me to sit in on this. I have to admit, I found the minister to be quite a humble man. I certainly enjoyed listening to him talk. And while I didn't say anything, which is unusual for me, I did enjoy hearing the comments from various chairs of the province. Thank you.
Bill, thanks very much for sitting in for me. And I know that there are going to be further meetings with the minister, and he has promised that. And I know, trustees, you may have many questions about some of the issues that were raised, and I think that they will be addressed in the director's report with regard to operations and management priorities and practices. So the second item, trustees, I would like you to keep the dates of June 3rd, 10th, and 17th open for regular and meetings. And at the June 3rd meeting, Trustee Danaher and I, especially Trustee Danaher, will be presenting our sale report. So I will now move to item 1101, which is the report of the Policy Committee. And I'm now going to turn this over to Trustee Don Cramp.
Thank you, Chair. Policy Committee met on May 8th when we went through 10 policies, 5 of which we're going to bring forward to you tonight. And we also started to prepare for next year with meetings in October. We are going to, again, try to go ahead with Microsoft Teams so we can meet virtually, which may be better for mileage and for timing for people. So we're going to start presenting tonight with Policy 230, which is the Employee Wellness and Work-Life Balance. And I believe the Chair has the motion.
Yes, thank you, Don. I have it here. I have 5 motions, and the first motion is moved by Don Cram, seconded by Corina Parisien, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve Policy 230, Employee Wellness and Work-Life Balance, as reviewed with revisions. So, trustees, you have that in front of you. Are there any questions you would like to direct to the Policy Committee?
Chair, I'd just like to comment that what we've done for this particular policy simply is to add the area to put the Board's employee assistance plan into this particular policy, and the rest of it pretty well stays the same.
Okay. Any other questions? Seeing none, I would ask trustees if you would cast your ballot.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you very much. I have a second motion, moved by Don Cram, seconded by Karina Parizien, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 240, work accommodation, as reviewed May 27, 2020. Trustee Cram?
Thank you, Chair. And as trustees can probably see, we are making absolutely no changes and are recommending no changes to this policy. We feel it works as it is.
Are there any questions, trustees? Hearing none, would you cast your ballot, please?
Chair McAllister, that motion carries unanimously.
Thank you. I have motion number 3, moved by Karina Parizien, seconded by David McDonald, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 436, naming and renaming of schools and sections of schools as reviewed with revisions May 27, 2020. And Trustee Parizien?
Through you, Chair, thank you. There wasn't much done to this policy except for we added the cross-reference above the Code of Conduct procedure, and we sort of removed the example because we felt it was a little bit not necessary. The explanation in the first paragraph without the example just seems a lot more structured as the policy.
Thank you, Trustee Parizien. Are there any questions? Seeing none, would you cast your ballot, please? Somebody has an open mic. If they could mute, please, that would be appreciated. That motion carries, I believe.
Yes, it does.
Thank you. And now we are going to move to motion number 4. It's moved by David McDonald, seconded by Don Cram, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 451, religious accommodation, as reviewed with revisions May 27, 2020. Trustee McDonald?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The most pressing issue is that the cross-reference was updated to include the assessment and evaluation exemption process. Other than that, there are no other changes that are recommended for the policy.
Any questions, trustees? If not, please cast your ballot.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. And I have a 5th motion. It's moved by Karina Parizien, seconded by David McDonald, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 1005, whistleblower, as reviewed with revisions May 27, 2020. And I would ask Trustee Parizien to speak to this, please.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. All we've done for this policy is added the 2 cross-references you see above, and then we've obviously removed the no accompanying procedure. The policy itself remains status quo as it was written previously.
Thank you very much. Any questions, comments? If not, please feel free to cast your ballot, please.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you very much. I want to make one comment with regard to the policy committee, and that is to thank them for their work on this. One of the important duties of trustees is to review and change and modify where necessary policies, and I think that we are doing a very good job, and I want to thank Trustee Cram and his committee for their work in this effort, okay? I'm going to move to 1201, which is the 2020-2021 budget projected expenses. And I'm now going to turn this over to Superintendent Jeremy Hobbs.
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you. I just flipped my mute back off, so I just want to make sure I'm still on.
No, I can hear you.
All good here, thank you. I think, Mr. Chair, this is the director. I think, Mr. Chair, that Mr. Hobbs may be having a technical difficulty. We'll just ask him to check his muting of his audio.
Okay, I'm back now, I think. Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you.
This is very ironic, Jeremy.
Sorry about that.
You need any help with the technical?
After doing IT for so many years, it seems to be the small things that trip you up. Go figure. I also have the same problem with fax machines and photocopiers. So just moving on, I'll restart because I didn't get very far. I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to bring back the next iteration in our dialogue around the 2020-2021 budget. As you know, on April 22nd, we brought forward a sort of a general outlook, the crystal ball gazing into the murky waters of the upcoming school year to see what, to bring you the best insight that the finance team could bring on the basis of what we thought was going to happen. So tonight, I'd like to just continue on with that and just advancing to slide 2, a discussion of the current state. So as you'll recall again, April 22nd, we presented a preliminary outlook. At that time, we estimated that based on what we could reasonably anticipate, we were estimating that we could land on about a $700,000 operating surplus budget position or budget forecast for the end of fiscal 2021, based on the prevailing assumptions and without incremental program spending. So the real story there is around the prevailing assumptions, and that was more or less the government would hold the course on funding for next year, and what we would see is fluctuations that were primarily enrollment-based. We still, as we said at the time, we still believe there's considerable uncertainty around the impact of COVID-19 on issues ranging from enrollments to funding. So, you know, as we talked about on April 22nd, there was a lot of uncertainty, and I think actually over the course of the last several weeks, it's become clear, and I think strong signals from the Ministry of Education that whatever our operating posture is for school in September 2020, the words I believe he used were it's going to be fundamentally different. You know, our hope on April 22nd was that we were going to receive information on the grants for student needs in early May, and as you know, the grants for student needs is an annual announcement from the Ministry of Education that describes the volume and the nature of our funding for the upcoming school year. And that really, our entire budget process really hinges on the grants for student needs because that gives us the specificity we need to know how we can spend. As it stands, we have not received the grants from student needs on this day of May 27th, although we understand from guidance from the Ministry of Education that those GSNs are imminent. But beyond that, we don't have any information about the funding, any more information than we had on April 22nd. So tonight, the tack we are trying to provide for you in looking at what can we tell you about the budget process in order for us all to advance our thinking as much as we can given the state of information. We're not here to present a budget. We can't provide you a great deal of insight into the funding for 2020-21 beyond what we shared on April 22nd. But we are trying to present some information on the anticipated expenses for the 2020-21 school year. So advancing on to slide 3, while we await funding information on the grants for student needs, as you know, there's 2 parts to an overall board budget. There's the funding or revenue component, which is comprised by the GSNs. And then there's, on the other side or below that, there's the expense budget, which describes how we would propose to spend that funding. a great deal of our expenses for 2020-21 have already been committed in many respects, owing to the fact that our collective agreements compel us to staff according to enrollment projections, and they compel us to actually make many of those decisions in the April timeframe, often or before GSNs are known, even at the best of times. So what we have attempted to do as a finance department, and certainly with the support and input from the senior team and other budget holders, is attempted to peel the onion, if you will, by going a layer deeper on the expense budget and talking to the individual budget holders of the departments in various areas in the organization about what they foresee their expenditure plans being for the upcoming school year. Of course, in the absence of any GSN information, we know that those expenditure plans may need to change, but again, our assumption really for the upcoming year is that more or less for now, let's work with the assumption that funding will remain more or less the same. So moving on to slide 4, our budget process priorities. So when we're starting a process, of course, the ultimate aim is for us to deliver a budget, but I think it's important for us to be reflective about how we actually do that and some of the measures of success or the success criteria that we might choose to apply in that process. So first of all, one of the actual priorities for us is to provide trustees comfort that they are able to exercise their oversight and decision-making roles through the budget process without feeling artificially rushed. So sometimes what happens at this time of year is we find ourselves up against a bit of a crunch, needing to get a budget approved and submitted to the Ministry of Education by the end of June. And I would say that my experience or my observation is that actually requires trustees to digest an awful lot of information and make an awful lot of difficult decisions in a short period of time. And to the extent possible, we're trying to actually find strategies to alleviate that pressure so people feel more comfortable if they're exercising their governance role to their satisfaction. The second piece is we want to ensure that the approved budget ultimately is compliant with ministry requirements, contractual obligations, and other requirements. So the GSN is one element that actually guides how we are to spend money. So it will show us how funding is enveloped among areas like special education or administration and governance and other areas. We have contractual obligations, as I've mentioned earlier, with regard to collective agreements that dictate both the nature and scale of the spending in different areas like staffing, and of course other requirements. And one of them obviously would be that, as you know, the ministry has a requirement for compliance with regard to budget that would limit the scale of a deficit that a board could run or plan to run if it so chose. So in many respects, the budget actually itself is a bit of an accounting compliance exercise designed to satisfy the Ministry of Education that we are kind of on the right track with regard to all of those requirements. The third process is that we want to provide a strategy to address stated board priorities. So we participated to some extent with trustees in some of those winter discussions about the priorities for the upcoming year and even before that. So there's been stated priorities around growing the accumulated surplus back again, which was depleted a year or so ago, expanding the Power Up program in special education, investing in elementary physical education and well-being specialists or to see what that looks like. There's been some other priorities around investing further in graduation coaches. And even more recently, I think in response to some of the stresses associated with the pandemic that have pressed on our capabilities as a system, an appetite to actually bolster our capability centrally to support distance learning and advance our capabilities out in the field in that regard. And finally, in light of the ongoing pandemic, we really want to, through the budget process, provide a strategy to allow the board to pivot resources to effectively respond to the actual operating conditions we're facing in September 2020. So front of mind for us, again, is those words by the Minister of Education that school, in some respects, will be fundamentally different in September. And, I think that this year we encountered the pandemic in the middle of the year. Our resources were already deployed in a way that supported a normal school working environment. But going into this upcoming fiscal year, if we have a sense that we won't be operating as normal in September, what capabilities can we preserve so that we can pivot our resources in a way that best supports students in the context they're facing in September. Moving on to slide 5, some of the assumptions regarding expenses. So very similar to what you saw from us on April 22nd, but starting to actually build the narrative here around what we're anticipating our expenses being for next year. So again, we started with the assumption that our 2019-20 expense structure will roll into 2020-21. Of course, we've updated classroom and school office staff affordability based on what we know of the collective agreements predominantly. We've updated school budget expense budgets. We've updated school operations budget expenses. So school operations referring primarily to my area of facilities operations. We've actually incorporated some of the expenses we know we are going to incur as a result of some of the centrally negotiated QP staffing initiatives. So in the past, you will have heard of things like local system priorities funding and education worker protection funds, which were two funding pots that were settled by centrally as a part of the QP collective agreements. And the HR team has been working and is working to settle with QP on what we're going to spend that money on, and so those expenses have been included. We know that there's a 1% salary increase that is incorporated based on centrally negotiated collective agreements for 2019-2021, and those have been incorporated as being assumed that we're going to be executing those next year. Whether it happens starting September 1st or retroactively for some employee groups, I think remains to be seen depending on where they stand in the flow of negotiation, but we know that's going to be an expense. STEO has approved a budget for 2020-21, again, based on their best estimate of what is likely to happen next year. And because this represents such a large portion of our overall operating budget, we wanted to incorporate that estimate of expenses for 2020-21 into our expense estimate. And then finally, just as another note, incremental expenses that were directed from the trustee table. So a more aggressive implementation of the Power Up program for special education, the framing and shaping of that elementary wellness coach specialist. We have definitely registered those requirements. We just haven't incorporated them into the expense budget yet, but the team, I think, among the senior team is working to give shape to what those might look like, so we can fold those into our estimate. So moving on to slide 6, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of what we see the total board operating spending being. And this is what we would consider to be an expense budget. So based on the information we have available, using the 2019-20 original budget that was approved back in June 2019, as a basis, this is how we see things evolving. So under the salaries and benefits line, last year in the original budget, we were estimating $278.3 million in spending on salaries and benefits across the board. This year, we see that jumping up to $293 million for 2020-21. Primarily, $5.6 million of that is related to recently negotiated union agreements. So as I mentioned, that 1% salary increase that would be effective September 1st, 2020. An additional $5.4 million in incremental staffing support. So as you know, I mentioned earlier, the Education Worker Protection Fund and Local System Priorities Fund that were funding sources that were part of QP collective agreement and designed to actually support incremental staffing. So that will be a large part of that additional $5.4 million. A further $3.7 million, was incorporated after the 2019-20 budget in other staffing increases. So increases to principals and vice principals, math and student success, SHISM Learning Partners, and LCI staff that were added after the budget, the budget motion. We have actually treated those as the starting point for the new school year. So those are also included. So that salaries and benefits is not really what I would consider to be, it's really largely driven by collective agreements and some of the opportunities that we chose to take in the 2019-20 school year. Another notable one I think that you would see here is a 9.4% decrease in supplies and services, so going from $24.4 million down to $22.1. I think that the 9.4% actually it's a bigger number on the table, but it's actually a fairly mundane explanation. So you're seeing a $400,000 shift in budgets from one line to another. So a shift in student success budget from supplies and services that they've shifted over to additional staffing in the student success and SHISM line. There's a $0.1 million reduction due to improved cell phone upgrade costs, so less expenditure than anticipated. A $1.2 million decrease in instructional and school operations and maintenance spending. So some of that is, again, this is not that we're spending less on school maintenance. We're spending a little bit less on supplies and services so we can bolster some of the staffing areas. So it's really not it's really a shift more than anything. And then a $0.6 million or $600,000 decrease in UCLC activity due to lower international education enrollment. The rest of the areas are fairly self-explanatory, but the result of this overall is that we would anticipate on expenditures only overall going from the approved budget of 2019-20 expenditures, which was $362.2 million, up to approximately $375 million, or an increase of $12.8 million, or 3.5%. So just moving on to slide 7, just gives you another sort of pie chart view of the high-level breakdown of that $375 million with that $12.8 million spending increase. And again, the pie chart really reflective of what we shared with you on April 22nd. So I've worked in 3 boards now, and I think this is my 15th or 16th budget with the Upper Canada District School Board. And that pie chart, as much as budgets change from year to year, we're always right in that pocket around mid-70%, 70 to 80% salaries and benefits, just by the nature of our organization. So moving on to slide 8. I'm not sure if I've increased your anxiety level by saying the expense budget is going to go up by $12.8 million, but this is quite a different scenario from last year, because virtually all of that $12.8 million in increased expenses are anticipated to be offset by increases in funding. So while we can't speak in detail to the actual GSNs and where the funding will come from, we definitely know there are some hard commitments the Ministry of Education has made, specifically to salaries and benefits funding associated with QP or with collective agreements in general. Their approach to how they fund depreciation expense, for example, and their anticipated funding or their past practice in terms of how they funded grid movements, for example. So just to break it down a little bit, slide 8, the title here is Anticipated Funding to Support the Change in Board Operating Spending. As I've mentioned, we anticipate, all things being equal and without further information to the contrary, that spending will go up next year by about $12.8 million, and that's a result largely of centrally negotiated collective agreements and other agreements. And the way we see that being offset is that approximately $5.6 million will be provided to support those centrally negotiated collective agreements. Another $5.4 million around QP staffing initiatives, local systems priority fund, and education worker protection fund. There's some depreciation expense to the tune of $0.9 million or $900,000 that is related to the depreciation or amortization of board capital assets. And there is also anticipated funding to the tune of $900,000 or $0.9 million for teacher and early childhood educator grid movement, salary grid movement. And to some extent, as you know, the Ministry of Education, with regard to school operations, they will fund for utility costs and commodity prices. They will provide a bit of an escalator allowance every year in terms of the school operations allowance, and we're anticipating a modest increment there to come as well. So moving on to slide 9. I think that we know that the organization, by virtue of the importance of this area to people and the magnitude of the impact, are particularly interested in the special education portion of spending. So generally speaking, I think what we are following the example of Superintendent Ferguson from last year, I think what we're doing is basically planning on trying to start out the 2020-21 school year very similarly in terms of our overall EA staffing as we started out the 2019-20 school year. So what you're seeing here as an increase in salaries and benefits is predominantly reflective of those increases in QP salaries and benefits lines. So an increase in salaries and benefits from $46.5 to $47.1 million, virtually entirely due to that 1% salary and benefit increase. And there's some increase in there as well of $1.8 million in incremental staffing supports associated with the QP, again, the QP deal. We've actually, as you may recall, back to December when our financial consultant, Roger Richard, presented revised estimates, there was a decision at that point to reallocate education assistant staffing costs to transportation, and that's reflective of the role that educational assistants actually play in ensuring students are getting on, special education students are getting on buses safely. So this $1.3 million reduction in education assistant staffing costs is not a reduction in our number of education assistants. It's just now being charged to transportation because a portion of their work is driven by ensuring the safe transportation of students when arriving at the school and when departing from the school. So again, you're seeing a bit of a net kind of zero effect here where that expense has moved to another area of the organization. And then finally, there's been overall a 0.6 million reduction between 2019-20 and 2020-21 related to SSP costs. And so there's been some changes there associated with in lieu of notice pay as a result of the downsizing that we undertook last year. All in all, I think what you're seeing is overall 1.2% increase in spec ed salaries and benefits, and overall anticipated expenditure, and really driven largely by that. The moral of the story is driven largely by the QP collective agreement settlement. Moving on to slide 10, what you're seeing here is again the same pie chart, except I think what's really notable, obviously, in the spec ed department is how slim a sliver of expenditure in the spec ed budget line is anything but salaries and benefits. So in contrast to the broader organization where 78% of our spend is anticipated to be salaries and benefits, in spec ed, the focus really is on providing supports to students who need special education support to the tune of 96% of the actual special education budget. So moving on to slide 11, priorities and uncertainties for 2020-21. So as I mentioned, the baseline forecast for expenses for 2020 and 2021 is currently $375 million. As I mentioned earlier, this does not yet address incremental program priorities such as accelerated expansion of the Power Up program in special education, or elementary well-being specialists, or the addition of grad coaches, or the addition of distance learning supports that we might want to deploy centrally if we are in more of a pandemic support situation. So that doesn't say that within the realm of that $375 million expenditure, there are certainly lots of ways that we can redeploy or adjust resources that we have at our disposal in that expenditure model to meet the aspirations of the board now and in the future. But in terms of incremental spend on top of that, we haven't actually factored in any of those program costs yet. As it stands, we feel that that $375 million spend, if our assumptions about funding are correct, would yield about, as I said on April 22nd, $700,000 surplus budget for us. And then so we've really actually tried to sort of hold the same kind of funding assumptions that we provided to you on April 22nd, so that we would end up in approximately the same kind of budget picture. The expense structure that we've put in place also doesn't acknowledge any kind of operational shift that may be required to respond to that ongoing pandemic. So I think the point here is that, probably 2 months ago or 3 months ago, we saw a pandemic coming, but I think even I would say until April 22nd, I think the predominant scenario that we were considering from a budget standpoint for 2020-21 would be that we would be returning to business as usual, more or less, in September. And I think that the benefit of an extra month and a bit that we've had since then is that we're starting to see that that business as usual scenario for September is becoming less and less likely. And I think as a part of the organization, the finance department that really wants to provide good strategic financial advice to the organization, one of our interests is making sure that the organization, to some extent, has options at its disposal should it wish to actually pivot resources to an operational model in September that is not normal. So in other words, if we have students who are still at home and need distance learning support or devices or whatever it happens to be, how can we actually pivot resources away from a normal sort of deployment and to a deployment that may be the sustained reality for weeks or months? So one of the things that we've been thinking about is how could we establish a fund, if you will, of unallocated potential funding that the trustees could choose to allocate in different ways when it becomes clear what the reality is going to be in September. So a few things that we consider to be options or potential options, recognizing the uncertainty that we've already described in the GSNs. So one example is that we know that having achieved central agreements with OSSTF and ETFO, the Ministry of Education and the government has actually made system priorities like funds like they provided to CUPE, those systems priorities funds, a part of that those deals with OSSTF and ETFO. Our estimate of the Upper Canada District School Board share would be about $2 million. And so we don't, I believe, have access to that funding until we conclude our local agreement. So therefore, we can't really at this time commit it because we don't have access to it. But once we actually conclude our collective agreements, we would have access to that and be able to work through an allocation process per the actual agreements that they've struck centrally. So that is a pot of money, if you will, that is a potential for us to allocate towards some of those priorities. The second piece that we have is the Rural and Northern Education Fund, or the RNEF, as you know, which the ministry, I think a couple of years ago, actually designated specifically for boards, rural boards like ourselves, and targeted towards a number of schools that they would classify as rural. For us, that represents $1.5 million, assuming that that continues to proceed forward in 2020-21, and would provide another source of funds that the trustees could choose to allocate. The third one, as you know, through Superintendent Ferguson, the Special Education Department has worked hard to really tap into the available special incidents portion or SIP portion funding that is available for special education. Historically, we haven't had haven't really tapped into that, but under Superintendent Ferguson's leadership and now Superintendent Perry's leadership, we've really ramped that up to the tune of applications for, as I recall, $3.1 million in SIP funding. We as yet have no information about what proportion of those applications will be funded. So as you know from previous presentations, we've taken a very conservative stance both for this fiscal year and the upcoming fiscal year, and saying that though we've estimated $3.1 million in applications, our actual, what we're planning on from a budgetary expenditure perspective or in a funding perspective is only to receive $750,000. So that $750,000 that we have planned is already baked into our expense budget of $375 million. However, were we to be much more successful we could potentially access up to another $2.3 million in SIP funding that we could then deploy consistent with the constraints on the funding towards those priorities. So all told, these are just, 3 potential funding pots that we think are notable because they, I think, strike a balance between a reasonable expectation of success in securing them, but also there's some uncertainty until we actually see the GSNs and see what happens with SIP that we're going to have them. But we think they're notable in the sense that there's enough of a chance that we're going to receive them that's worthwhile thinking about that as potentially a pot for allocation totaling up to $5.8 million. So a potential approach. So here we are again. I'd just like to emphasize, and I'll wrap up very quickly here, that again, we're not here tonight, unfortunately, being able to share with you details of the grants for student needs, but we are trying to hopefully advance the conversation, recognizing how quickly the world is changing around us, and recognizing that trustees still have an appetite for getting their heads around the budget process for 2020-21. So one of the things that we think we might be able to do, addressing those sort of budget priorities that I identified early in my slideshow, is that, first of all, the pandemic has contributed to a later than normal GSN. I think later than normal is probably the best euphemism I could come up with, but it's late, extremely late. And we're seeing that, as I said, the September startup will be fundamentally different than normal in as yet unspecified ways. And we just have to think back to how much the world has changed around us in the last 2 months to think about how much it might change, or maybe not, in the next 2 months. So we're suggesting, therefore, that in order to avoid rushing major incremental spending decisions in order to get that accounting exercise budget off to the Ministry of Education, one of the things that we're thinking of is that we would consider, or we would ask the board to think about potentially passing a compliant budget in the June timeframe, largely based on the 19-20 budget plus our contractual commitments. Once we've received the GSNs, and we can package it all up into a budget. But we would hold off potentially on allocating or committing unallocated funding sources until the operational reality for September is better known. And then I use the term micro-budget process, but to me it would be really a question of saying, as funding sources materialize and come in or are available for allocation, there could be a process by which the board could review its list of priorities in light of the current circumstances and agree to allocate those resources on a priority basis through a kind of micro process. And part of the intent there is to avoid rushing major policy decisions, as I mentioned earlier. And the second piece is to optimize our ability to respond to reality as it evolves, recognizing that we may very well be well into August before we actually have a good visibility into what the opening stance is going to be for school in September. But that is really, we present this slide really as not for decision, but really for thought purposes. Moving on to slide 13, proposed budget timeline. Obviously, the slide that we presented that looked like this back on April 22nd has been blown entirely out of the water by the fact that we don't have the GSNs. So we are now hoping that late May instead of early May, we're going to have the anticipated release of the GSNs. And really, it would be great if we got them this week. We are looking at working with Superintendent Perry about what, if anything, we can present at SEAC, recognizing that the later the GSN delay goes on, the harder it is to go to people with information that's worthwhile to them. On June 3rd, we're hoping that we could bring back to board a GSN update, and this is something we are planning on doing tonight. As time goes on, I think it's going to be harder and harder for us to digest GSNs when they eventually come out and whip that into a presentation. But I think that if it came out in the next couple of days, we could probably put something together that would give you at least our first impressions. Again, if the GSN was released this week, we think we could potentially put a budget for thinking about on the 17th. But we would certainly not expect any kind of approval on the 17th. And I think that it would be important for us to note that, as you know, the Ministry of Education has extended the deadline, I believe, for budget submission this year to August 30th. So, that there's certainly not the pressure as there was in previous years to make a snap decision on June 17th or June 30th to get it in by the start of the summer. Moving on to slide 14. So just to recap, this is a preliminary projection of expenses only. So again, the concept is peeling the onion here. So we've taken it several levels of detail deeper than what we had on April 22nd. Thanks largely to the senior team and budget holders who've sort of gone through line by line their budgets to look at whatever notable changes they might see coming for the upcoming year and submitting their forms back, and our team for rolling them up. Initial operating expenses are projected to be $375 million up in 2020-21, up from $362.2 million in 1920. Changes are primarily related to labor costs, and it's projected that all of those increases in expenses will be offset by corresponding increases in revenues or funding, because those are largely based on commitments that were made by the Ministry of Education through the collective bargaining process. And we would like to just, I don't need to tell you that considerable uncertainty exists regarding the impact of COVID-19 on issues ranging from enrollments to funding, and really just trying to find some room here in the budget for us to be able to, as an organization, respond to the situation as it evolves in the interest of providing the best possible support to our students. And moving on to slide 15, thank you very much for your time, and sorry for my mute issues at the start of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Hobbs. I will now open the floor to discussion or questions.
I have one, Mr. Chair, John McCrae.
Go ahead, Trustee McCrae.
Thank you. Jeremy, in keeping with your prudent approach towards keeping some in reserve, where are you in regard to the capital budget and school retrofits that may be necessary for pandemic approach?
Mr. Chair, I didn't catch all of that question, so I was wondering if perhaps you or Trustee McCrae might be able to repeat it, just so I could. I think I heard it was a reference to capital.
Yes, Jeremy, it's yes, and retrofits that probably will be necessary at the schools. And then you've mentioned in the past how important it is to have the summer work season. Where are you in those retrofits and the capital budget?
Sure. So thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Chair, just putting on my facilities operations hat. I don't want to spill all the beans from my portion of the COVID-19 update later on. But as you'll hear later on as part of the Director's larger update on our COVID-19 pandemic response, we're in the process, as per the sort of direction from our local medical officers of health, that we are able to actually resume maintenance and operations work at schools effective May 19th, I believe. So we're in the process of actually preparing to send our custodians back to work on day shifts to start working on schools to basically do stepped-up cleaning. Number two is prepare them for access by daycare should the government choose to opt into a more aggressive update on or aggressive expansion of daycare operations. We're in the process now of looking at and sort of designating a very preliminary round of retrofit on school offices, so doing things like plexiglass shields and those kinds of things. So we're working on sourcing that material. And then I think from a capital standpoint, as much as we can of the regular work that we had scheduled for this summer, we're beginning to undertake again as time and the availability of supply chain and contractors will permit. But we do have a very significant reserve of capital funding in our capital budgets that would allow for retrofits provided it qualifies for capital, and also considerable latitude within our maintenance and operations budget for non-capital kind of furniture and equipment type updates as needed. So I think we're fairly well positioned there. Really just look more for guidance as to, what's going to happen and what do we need to do. So we've got the money. We're just waiting to hear more about what to do with it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions?
Through you,
evening, Chair. Trustee Schooler here.
Go ahead, Trustee Schooler.
Couple of questions. The first is around the staff development line. I'm wondering, is that amount an enveloped amount, or is it established at the discretion of the board?
I don't, through you, Mr. Chair, I would venture to say that by and large it's not enveloped, but there may be cases where you have a PPF, like a policy and partnership fund that would be targeted at a specific area by the Ministry of Education that would stipulate that there's some of it to go to staff development. But I think that there's a fair amount of discretion on the part of the trustees and to the superintendents within their own operating lines about how they deploy staff development according to the priorities for the year. Generally speaking, I would say from experience as someone who's an operational line manager, it ebbs and flows based on the priorities that we have in the department for a given year. So some years are more intensive in certain areas than others. And then, of course, the only I think system-wide, and Superintendent Ferguson may be able to speak to more, is that there are some things that are common. I'm not sure it would be called staff development or professional development, but training requirements for things like WHMIS, health and safety, and things that are done sort of centrally on behalf of the organization and all departments. But not generally restricted, and a fair amount of latitude in terms of how.
Thank you. And second question, I noticed that on the other expenses line, there's an increase of 100% from last year's budget to this year's budget. I'm just wondering what accounts for that 100% increase in other expenses, and perhaps you could enlighten us as to what would come under the category of other expenses.
It's only it's $100,000 increase, so I'd actually have to dig into what that specifically is. I'm just on, is this slide 6, Trustee Schooler? So I think what it is the $100,000 you're referring to. So the expense budget on that other expenses line went from $100,000 or $0.1 million to $0.2 million. And that's related to minor increases in student bursaries and awards and some association or membership fees for staff. So that would be the predominant amount that would have accounted for that increase of $100,000. And it may, I think what I understand is that that's not necessarily a straight increase. It could have been a reallocation from another line as well.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I have a couple of comments, questions.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Thank you. I do want to just pick up on Superintendent Hobbs' suggestion around looking at having a budget passed, but not allocating the funds. And I think that's very prudent on our part. I think we know that there is going to be, and the reason why the GSNs have been delayed is because we know that there are going to be things that need to be addressed from the province as a whole, but more particularly around education for us. So, they're taking their time to make sure that they have this lined up and putting things into perspective. So, I think for us to be able to, have in our back pocket a plan for how we're going to approach some of the things that we'd like to approach, so that when we do get the funding, we can have the discussion and decide whether that's the direction we want to go, and we can roll it out, or do we need to have a different direction based on some of the circumstances that are going to be presented to us in September. And we know that that's not going to happen. We don't know what September is going to look like until potentially late June. So, and that's going to be best guess at that point as well. So I like that approach. I think it's important for us to kind of maintain that focus and move forward in that direction. My question, though, is coming back to some of the priorities that we talked about, and we talked about an increase in PUP, and we talked about the mental health piece. So, we've had those discussions for some time. Where are we with what that would look like? I mean, rather than coming into a budget just being presented a dollar amount, where is the plan on what that is? We're blue sky thought process for us to say that this is something we're looking at, but what does the plan look like? Who's responsible for it, and when can we see that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is that we're working. The team is working through sort of bringing some shape to those initiatives, and I know I've spoken to Superintendent Perry as recently as this afternoon about giving some shape to the expansion of the Power Up program, and specifically Power Up Program 2, which is one of the things that's a major thrust area of interest for the trustees. And I believe, we're still working through what it looks like to for those wellness and the elementary wellness specialists. But maybe I can, perhaps ask Director Klewa if he's got anything to add to that.
Mr. Chair, through you, we are continuing to work on the plan. We want to dovetail that with a range of possible options or expenses for the board to consider. As you heard in tonight's meeting, our original intent was to bring that as part of the spring budget. We're certainly prepared to bring that in the spring, or if it would be more prudent to bring that in the fall, as Mr. Hobbs had presented this evening, we would be certainly receptive to do that. So I guess, Mr. Chair, we'll take the direction on the board about when you would like to see that prevail at your table, whether it's this spring or this fall. We're happy to deliver either with the circumstances of the range of options that the board could choose from in both those program priorities.
Thank you very much to all three of you.
Can I just have a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something, if I could, before you ask your second question, your supplementary. I think what you are pointing to is, will there be a range of options under the two priorities that we have established? So am I right in that assumption?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Trustee McDonald?
Yeah, I think a range would be good, but as I said, it was blue sky thinking. So, what does it actually look like? And so, we were presented with some information about a very preliminary and very cost intensive program, but what does that program look like? And I think for us to be able to understand whether we want to prioritize money, we need to understand what it looks like, and whether we do it now or allocate the funds based on when we get the funds. It's important for us to make sure that it's either going to be included in the potential, or whether we think it's something that we need to postpone. And it doesn't mean just for the mental health. We need to make any of those types of things need to be in front of us now.
I'm wondering, Director or Superintendent, if you could address that issue.
So, Mr. Chair, through you, I think if that's the will of the board to have it sooner than later, we'll certainly bring that forward, either concurrent with the next budget report or before. We'll be working with Superintendent Hobbs and the portfolio holders in those two priority areas, and we will be bringing back that information to the board.
Trustee McDonald, is that satisfactory?
Yeah, and I appreciate your help with this, Chair. I think it's just important for us, beyond a range, we want to make sure that we understand the scope of the project, and if we want to put something in place, what are we expecting from an outcome? So, that's something that we need to be cognizant of. If we're going to spend, and I'm just going to put money out there, like if we're going to spend $5 million on something, is it going to achieve something from our strategic plan and be relevant to our mission, vision, and values, or is it just going to be an expenditure but not have any particular outcome to it? And I think that's something that the board needs to be able to have an understanding of as we move forward. So thank you, and I think if we can get that information, it would certainly help bring some more discussion.
True, and I think we will ask our staff to do that. I believe what you're really asking is a bit more information about both those priorities and how it will impact our budget and what the outcomes will be. So I assume that that will come perhaps at one of the next two meetings, June 3rd or June 17th. Would that be satisfactory?
Yes, Mr. Chair, through you, that's correct.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Chair, I have a comment.
Trustee McDonald, is that satisfactory to you?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee Graham.
Chair, with the dates coming up, sorry, I got my English straight here. With those priorities coming forward in the next little while, I'd rather see us a meeting on the 10th that you've been asked for us to put aside so that we have either the 3rd or the 10th. I think the 17th is getting a little too late.
I would agree. And we have reserved the 3rd, the 10th, and the 17th for a variety of issues. And budget may certainly well be one of them, okay? Is that okay, Trustee Graham?
Yes, Chair, that's fine. I muted my phone in between, so yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If not, Superintendent Hobbs, thank you for your presentation. It was very clear. And thank you very much. We are going to move on to 1202, which is update number 5 on the operations management priorities and practices for COVID-19. So I will turn this over to Director Sliwa, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, good evening again, trustees. This is our report that we bring to you each month to update you on operations management during the pandemic crisis. And it's really important that staff have an opportunity to flag where the big efforts and big pushes are right now. We wanted to make sure, Mr. Chair, that in presenting this evening's report, that you see that we're both today focused and have a today mindset and also tomorrow focused and developing that tomorrow mindset. You heard a bit about that already through Mr. Hobbs in his presentation a moment ago, and it's our pleasure as staff to bring that forward to you to highlight that. In terms of our today mindset or today focus, you'll hear from our staff to speak to some immediate school operations matters where we're at in terms of managing our sites, and again, that which remain closed, of course, given the most significant news that's happened in May, which was when the Minister of Education last Tuesday provided the announcement that schools would remain closed for the 2019-2020 year, so for the remainder of this current school year, and then looking at what that means in terms of our going forward. Equally important, Mr. Chair, right now is to share with the board about how senior staff and our middle management and principals, vice principals are being drawn into a critical conversation around our tomorrow mindset and being very clear that we need to be building a preliminary plan to examine how we're going to engage in the operation of schools for next fall. And I should share as well, Mr. Chair, that a complete shutdown of course, school facilities and a break from our regular in-person teaching model for this duration was, of course, nothing that anybody could have anticipated 3 months ago. That has changed dramatically with each update from the Ministry of Education and the province, that as they refresh the declaration of the state of emergency, schools remain closed, and we continue to evolve and build our distance learning model beyond its then present state prior to all this, to enhance it, to ensure that we are addressing it at a more robust level, given that that is defining our current realities right now. And as you heard from the minister's announcement last week that we are looking at a future state that would be a lot different than what our current state was last September. Mr. Chair, we'll speak a bit more as well this evening to the information contained in the planning document that was attached to this evening's report, and I'll look forward to updating trustees about where we're at in our planning process as an organization and what we see on the horizon in terms of how that process will dovetail with the provincial process that's also underway. In the end, Mr. Chair, we hope that what comes out of this evening's discussion is that both the Board of Trustees, our parent community and students and the public at large will have an idea about what we're trying to do to wrap up this current operational year, and in terms of the distance learning and operational considerations in terms of some other matters, and also to give a flavor about how we're looking at approaching the start of the next school year, notwithstanding all the uncertainties and clarifications that are still pending from the provincial government and our local public health. So, Mr. Chair, to begin, I'm going to invite Superintendent McNair, who's on the line, to walk through the school operations piece that right now is our today focus. And Mr. Hobbs will also have an opportunity to comment as well beyond perhaps anything that he shared with you about what we're doing in terms of supporting schools in its current state and preparing for some restricted access to school by some other parties. So I'll turn it over to Superintendent McNair first, Mr. Chair, to get us started.
Good evening. Can you hear me, Steve?
Thank you very much. Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thanks. So as Director Sliwa mentioned, our schools still remain closed. We do have some daycare sites operating on our properties. And, of course, our school grounds also remain closed at this time. We are working very closely with our health unit partners as we proceed to look at some additional accesses to schools in the coming weeks. And I will certainly let my colleague, Mr. Hobbs, speak about some of those access points as well, one being looking for families to be able to collect their child's belongings. And, of course, we have various processes. Our special education teams are looking to be into schools to complete the IPRC review process. And we have working really closely with our construction department and our facilities team and our IT team, who are also looking to access the schools to complete some various projects that are planned underway. So I will turn it over now to Mr. Hobbs to share a bit more.
Thank you, Superintendent McNair. I'm just like to speak briefly to elaborate on some of my remarks in my earlier budget presentation. So first of all, the Minister of Education made an announcement on the 19th of May to extend the closure of all schools until June 2020. And led, as we approach the end of the school year, leads to many questions from parents in an escalating manner who have been looking to access the school to pick up their child's personal belongings from the local school. In addition, there's a number of other end-of-year functions that school staff really need to perform and need to have some access to the school. So one of the things we're working on is a plan for this and starting to actually incorporate the hot off the presses guidelines that the Ministry of Education released late this afternoon in terms of how that's accomplished. As I mentioned in my earlier update, one of the things that we've noted over the course of the last few weeks and as we get closer to the end of the school year is that there is a bit of an escalating set of requests to access the school for a variety of legitimate purposes. And thus far, under the leadership of Superintendent McNair, we've been really working with our local health units and medical officers of health to make sure that each one of these was treated as a separate instance, supported by a documented process, vetted by the medical officer of health, executed, and then closed off. But as these increase in frequency, what we're doing is looking at, number one, bringing custodians back into schools in line with the minister's and the government's allowance for us to resume maintenance and operations activities. And that will, I think, actually streamline the process or open up some options to us for safely doing this, of course, in concert with the medical officers of health. So what you're going to see happen, I think, on Monday will be that we're going to start seeing custodians working day shifts in schools, starting to make the schools ready through step-up cleaning, making daycare spaces ready in case daycares start ramping up slightly in the coming weeks, and also starting to execute some of those functions I spoke about earlier, such as putting in shields and those kinds of things in office spaces in preparation for some eventual return on the horizon. In the meantime, as I mentioned, what you'll hear more from us about is how parents can access their schools to get their child's personal belongings once we have an opportunity to digest the ministry's guidance, documents and processes, and then vet those through the medical officers of health. That's it for me. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, we'll turn it back over to Superintendent McNair, who will have just a quick update on where we're at in terms of secondary school and elementary school graduation celebrations and acknowledgements, and elementary school school leaving ceremonies. We know that this is important to all of us. Our students' accomplishments are significant and they deserve to be recognized. And at the same time, we're trying to find the proper way of engaging this that keeps people safe and recognizes as well that we're under a state of emergency, that we have a pandemic, a global pandemic that our local communities are trying to manage successfully so it doesn't become a greater risk than it is. And at the same time, knowing that for young people, these are important moments for them through their journey through the school system. So over to Superintendent McNair again for a comment about where that rests right now.
Thank you, Director Sliwa. Our senior team has worked closely with a focus group of principals in secondary to discuss celebration ceremonies a bit later in June. We've collected all the data from our 21 secondary schools as well as our TR Leger sites, gathering some input on some possible graduation celebrations. We are in the process today. We've had a meeting with the Lanark, Leeds and Grenville Health Unit, and tomorrow we'll be meeting with the Eastern Ontario Health Unit to review some of the suggestions that have been brought forward, and then put together the final touches on our guidelines for our schools so that they can continue planning their celebrations for our grade 12 students. We are looking to run these, execute these celebrations between June 12th and June 26th. So our schools are working with their grad committees to look at the various components of the celebrations, and senior administration will look to connect back with our principals later this week. In terms of our elementary leaving ceremonies and or graduations at grade 6 and grade 8, we also created a focus group with a group of principals throughout our district. And we've had 2 meetings thus far that we have gathered lots of insights and information from the school communities as well. I know our principals are reaching out to parents and students to gather some insights, and we are putting together those recommendations. And similar to how we've been working with our secondary schools, we will do the same for our elementary leaving ceremonies. We will consult public health as needed on some of the guidelines that might come forward, and then we will work back with our schools so that they can properly communicate to their families and communities what some various elementary leaving ceremonies would look like. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, through you, I just wanted to take a few minutes to update trustees on what they saw both in the summary report and the fuller, more robust report attached to tonight's agenda regarding the parent survey. So trustees will see the results from the survey that we had commissioned from May 12th to May 19th. And the results are actually quite encouraging in terms of some immediate feedback that you saw in some of the pie charts that are there, including the majority of parents feel that the work activities and student assignments provided up to that point of the survey were either seen as being appropriate and reasonable, or in some cases that parents would like to see even more material, more opportunity provided to some students in their families. And at the same time, we do also recognize that some families, about just slightly over 25%, would either like less activities or feel that this information opportunity learning materials might be too difficult, and that there needs to be a reset on what some schools might be providing. Also, Mr. Chair, important to us was to get some preliminary feedback from how parents felt their schools were staying in touch with them and how the school board was staying in touch. Some pretty similar findings in one respect, that to say that just over 80% felt that their schools were either doing a terrific job or they were satisfied with the results of the school's efforts to keep in touch with home and school. And I do think that that continues to be a high priority for us. As you know, Mr. Chair, we have 3 goals guiding our distance learning strategy right now. One of them is that schools are keeping in touch with students and their families to let them know that we're here and we're prepared to serve and support them in any way that would be reasonably leveraged given our circumstances of learning from a distance and being able to provide that support in the same manner. Mr. Chair, you also will see that the results from the just over 3,600 families that responded to the survey, that almost 40% of the people who responded were very pleased with the communication from the school board, and an additional 47% were very pleased with, were satisfied with the communication. So again, we're looking at over 86% of the families that responded to the survey felt that the school board, again, was keeping families informed about distance learning and overall school operations, which again is absolutely critical to where we're at. In terms of using the findings of the survey to improve and to better where we're at in our process and in our service delivery and approach to distance learning, it's not lost on us some of the anecdotal information, which we're still crunching at this time, which was that respondents identified that flexibility of this access to distance learning and how the assignments were teed up each week made a difference in terms of how students felt that it was going to be manageable and a reasonable experience for them. One of the key findings that we have is a need to universalize a specific set of board-approved apps that supports learning. We know that there is certainly applications that the Ministry of Education promotes, such as Desire to Learn, D2L, and Brightspace. We're also looking at what other options we can provide to our schools that is both user-friendly, maintains the appropriate focus on the protection of and privacy of that information that's exchanged on that app, and then lastly, to ensure that we are not providing so many different portals and platforms that parents find the ability to engage and participate in their child's learning overwhelming, because there is too many apps that we are using, and so we're looking at that very closely. The other element that actually aligns very strongly with where the Ministry of Education is positioned and had provided a guidance and direction to all school boards in Ontario, and you heard that from your trustee association, Mr. Chair, was ensuring that the synchronous learning component of distance learning is one that is robust and happens in real time. And we saw that in terms of our feedback from the parent community as well. Respondents want their children to be able to see, hear, talk, and interact with staff and their classmates. And so I know that our teaching and learning department has been working very vigorously with schools and our staff to look at what is our current state, how to improve that, and then to make sure that we can confirm that that is a key component of our distance learning model in all schools as we're going forward. So, Mr. Chair, I mentioned as well a companion survey to this piece will be what we're bringing to Student Senate at the end of this week. We look forward to the Senator's feedback, and it's our intention to release that student survey for our students in grades 7 to 12 as a first and preliminary effort to snapshot what the student experience was with distance learning, and that, again, to use that information to support staff development and training, and also to build an insight in our staff's understanding about how students and their families have regarded this distance learning experience that the school board has been providing since school closure. So, Mr. Chair, through you, I'm going to turn this back over to you to see if there's any other comments or questions.
Thank you, Director. Trustees, there are 3 areas here. The first one is school operations, and there are 4 bullets under each of those. Should we deal with those things first, and then we'll get to the second one, the second bullet, and then the third? So, school closures, school grounds, planning underway for additional access to schools, and secondary school graduation celebrations. So, should we deal with that, one of those 4 first? Any questions?
Mr. Chair, I have a question on the operations side.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
My question is really around access to the premises, and I know some information has come out fairly recently, as Superintendent Hobbs said tonight. But what is the plan, and how have we engaged the school leaders in this process?
Mr. Chair, through you, I'll begin, and then I'll ask Superintendent McNair to comment because she has been coordinating that. Up to the point of receiving some provincial guidance late this afternoon regarding building a standard capacity for admitting families and students to school to collect their personal belongings. We've been working with public health about did they have any general guidelines to do that. As we know, part of the challenge here, which is the same challenge that we were facing when we were distributing tech assets earlier in May and late April, was the fact that there is a restriction on no more than 5 people being gathered in a site, and we look at the math of that, and the math of that was that it would take some time to do that, and it would take also a full endorsement from public health to, as we've done for anything that's regarded access to schools, to make sure that we are aligned with what they believe would keep people safe. Going forward, right now, we're looking at several different elements in terms of what does it mean for people to be present in the building, and how do we manage that? Do we have to look at the possibility of disinfecting of any kind of articles, or giving directions to people who are collecting those articles what they need to know as they take that from the school environment to their home environment? We also know, Mr. Chair, that it's going to be critical to also to clarify the need to ensure that if there's any staff on site, that physical distancing would be respected. Those are sort of the general brushstrokes right now. We are bringing this information back to our weekly briefing with principals, vice principals, and department managers, and that each week as well, superintendents are meeting with their family of schools principals groupings, and from there we do an exchange in terms of the hot topics that relate to operational items. I'll just ask Superintendent McNair to confirm whether I've got that covered or whether there is anything that we missed that might be germane to responding to the question.
Through you, Chair. Thank you, Director Sliwa. I was going to add the information of our district meetings on Thursdays with all administrators, and then the family of schools superintendents follow up on Fridays in our family of school meetings. And between Dennis Kaluk, our health and safety specialist, and myself, we receive a lot of communication back from our principals when we share with them that we are working on an upcoming protocol. So we greatly we greatly appreciate all the communication and suggestions that are sent to us via email or phone calls that we can consider when we compile our different possible access to the building.
So just to follow up, Mr. Chair.
Sure, go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
And I guess I've heard that you welcome it and that kind of thing, but from what I'm hearing is that they haven't been engaged in this yet. So we haven't gone to them and said, what does it look like? What are your suggestions? What's the feedback from what we've learned when you were on the ground doing the technology piece? So did I hear that correctly, that we haven't actually engaged school principals yet in this process?
Through you, Chair. So after each access on our upcoming week family of schools, we do take some time to reflect our learnings from those previous access. So principals will provide us information on our calls, on our family of school check-in calls, and then we will look to compile any of that feedback that we give when we create next access. But particularly related to this access, we haven't had a specific discussion where we've asked for suggestions, but mentioning that this access is coming, principals have been able to provide us with opportunities on our individual family of schools calls.
Okay, so that's going to happen tomorrow then, that you're going to specifically ask for that feedback?
So Friday would be the day of our next family of schools call. So we will mention it tomorrow, and then we can certainly inquire for some additional feedback on Friday.
And if I may follow up with that then, so if we're going to grant access to the school and get that feedback from principals, from a senior leadership standpoint, how many other staff are going to be available to assist with that to ensure that we have compliance with our 6 feet separation and ensuring that we have the physical distancing within our building?
Through you, Chair. So we do know that the Eastern Ontario Health Unit had drafted up some guidelines that would help us with this. They just were waiting on the information today that we received today, late afternoon from the ministry, and then they were going to work with us to help us, kind of narrow down what that particularly could look like, because it will look different in different schools depending on the size and, of course, depending on the age level of students or families that need to collect their personal belongings.
Okay, so my question is, what other staff are going to be included? So the guidelines I can understand. I work in a facility where we monitor guidelines and we're restricting access into the building based on those guidelines, but I have staff to help with that. So what other staff are going to be used to assist this process?
Through you, Chair. So we would reach out and work with the school principal and also see some additional help from whether it be our teaching staff or potential our QP staff that may be able to assist us. And of course, we would have our custodians on site as well.
Just a supplementary here to that. On a personal note, my granddaughter is also wondering when she can retrieve a certain device that she has at school.
That would be part of when we let them come in or we organize for retrieving their personal belongings, and there'll be a variety of things because we'll need to certainly understand what it is that some families need to retrieve.
Trustee McNair, I guess it would be addressed to you. I have a question, a personal question here. It concerns the secondary school graduation celebrations. I know we've put these on hold until next year, but and I know that you have a committee that are working to plan a celebration this spring that recognizes the achievements of our graduates, but also fits within public health guidelines. I guess my question here is, you know, whether it be Athens District High School or Tugwa or CCDS or Charlotte or Glengarry, each of our schools have a very different culture and tradition. And my question is, how are we respecting that?
Through you, Chair. So we created a survey that we sent out to the 21 schools and from our focus group of principals that met to discuss some various ideas that schools may want to consider in celebrations for this spring. And all those surveys were shared back with us today. And so then we compiled that data to bring it to each of the school boards to receive their approval and insights on whatever the guidelines might look like. And then we want to ensure that we take those back and have those conversations with our secondary school principals so that they can meet whatever the guidelines are that the health units have put forth for us, and that we can honor the ideas that the grad committees at each of the schools have suggested. So it's really a working committee that started with a focus group of principals, brought out to the secondary schools, and they have grad committees, which include students, staff, potentially parents, sometimes the school council chair. They work together to put forward to us their suggestions, and then we're looking to share those suggestions with our health unit to achieve their kind of suggestions to make sure we're within the public health guidelines.
Thank you, Marcia. Any other questions? Any other questions on the school operations, the first bullet?
Through you, Chair, I have a question.
Go ahead, Trustee Perry-Zan.
My question is, what is our current position on report cards? What are parents to be expected? What are teachers to be expected? Is it going to be the normal report card we used to receive, or?
Mr. Chair, through you, I'm going to ask Superintendent Beauchamp to address that because he has been working with his team and making sure that our system is responding to the most recent Ministry of Education directive around assessment and evaluation. Now, granted, the most recent directive came out this morning at 11 o'clock, and so our team and staff have not had a chance to digest that. But he can answer to each of those questions, I think, that the trustee had just raised. So over to Mr. Lochbaum.
Thank you, Director Siwa, and to you, Chair. To report that sharing communication regarding assessment, evaluation, and reporting has been a priority for us. And we've continued to update our principals and ask them to continue to update their staff members in basically letting them know that growing success, the assessment evaluation pulse that guides our work, has been invested this year, and to provide them with guidelines for completing assessment evaluation and reporting. As Director Sliwa said, we just received an update this morning, and we are going to look at that information, compare it to the previous information that has been shared, and clarify any messaging that has changed. And so that information will be shared within the next day or so. With respect to report cards, students will be receiving a report card. And part of our communication to principals will be to provide them with guidance and support in terms of completing them, subject areas where they feel they have not yet evidence to report accurately, and how to move forward with that task.
Mr. Chair, through you, I just want to make sure, I know that Mr. Lochbaum might have, his audio is cutting a little bit in and out, but just to confirm the last piece, As directed by the Ministry and as expected by the Board of Trustees, all students will receive a final report card, and that has been shared and communicated with parents in late April, early May. Right now, we are confirming how we would be reporting on different work that was completed and work that was incompleted, how we convey that to parents with regards to the student being prepared for the next level of work.
Director, if I could follow up on that question, with regard to report cards, are we expecting more or less or the same as any other board in the province?
Mr. Chair, through you, we follow the Ministry's guidance and most recent information today, which is there is a need to be able to provide feedback about what the student has accomplished and the grade or level that it was accomplished at, so that would be consistent province-wide for all school boards. In addition, the expectation that all students are receiving a report card is a standard expectation for all school boards in Ontario.
Thank you very much.
Through you, Chair?
Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
I'm just wondering then, are you there? Comment?
Oh, yes, I'm here.
Sorry, I dropped my glasses. I'm just wondering then, in comment section, I mean, the Ministry said that they'd get the marks that they came out with on the last report. So will the comments say how successful or where they need to improve in the long-distance learning module?
Mr. Chair, through you, it's quite clear that from at least today's information that was provided, and again, staff have not had a chance to go through it thoroughly, that there are report card comments where we don't believe that there is adequate information to be able to provide feedback. There is always the use, whether this is during the pandemic period or in a business as usual experience, there's the opportunity to provide the letter I, and I would stand for incomplete. It's also clear that the March 13th threshold is a key time for providing commentary, whether it's learning skills or on the general assessment of learning. And so I think, Mr. Chair, to the trustees' comments, parents should see some elements that's familiar, where the school and the classroom teacher has the ability to comment on that. Where the ability is not there to comment on the student's achievement, the I indicator would be provided there. Raised an excellent point in the trustees' query about how do we acknowledge that the report card comments were a result of the continued closures, and this is the best effort to provide feedback to students and families. And I do believe that we have the opportunity to provide that notation either in the principal's comment box or perhaps with teachers. That will be explored further, Mr. Chair, but we appreciate the advice about having that caveat.
Trustee Perry, do you feel your question was answered satisfactorily?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I'm moving on to school operation, the parent survey, and the review and development of a comprehensive plan. Now, are there any further questions on this report? Okay, seeing none, ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to move to 1203, which is the Upper Canada District School Board Culture Survey, Recommendation 4, the student experience as it relates to the availability of material and equipment for student success. And I will turn this over to student trustee Colton Telford, who will be assisted by Director Sliwa when necessary. Go ahead, Colton.
Good evening, everyone. At the December 2019 Student Senate meeting, students prioritized the resources that were most important to them during the time at school. The top two priorities were identified as access to staff and access to the board's network resources, or Wi-Fi. During the consultation, student senators indicated that Wi-Fi or access to teachers and campus and facility space to support learning were resources that were accessible from a range of satisfactory to unsatisfactory levels, depending on specific school setting. The Senate meeting in February 2020, senators identified specific needs that they saw as it related to improving access to the resources. In some cases, students referenced resources optimization with recommendations for further attention to the maintenance and repair of computer hardware. As well, we also heard from senators seeking the restoration of specific resources, such as greater access to the school's learning commons space and the renewal of textbooks using funds. That seems to be a true topic of contention, just to keep that in mind. In addition to hosting a consultation with student senators, a sequent dialogue focus group was initiated with members of the UCDSB Parent Involvement Committee. The first focus meeting was scheduled to take place in late February 2020. However, inclement weather led to limited engagement during session 1. Owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, a follow-up session is not taking place at this time. At its most recent meeting on the 21st of May 2020, the UCDSB Parent Involvement Committee decided to continue the conversation as its next meeting in the fall of 2020. While a more robust consultation is pending, the preliminary findings will be brought back to UCDSB Operations Council and Executive Council for further review and discussion. So, if you would like to take a quick look through the summary of our last meeting, it gives you a summarization of what these senators believed were adequate and inadequate. And it just kind of helps walk you through this nice visual chart.
Do you want to walk us through further?
Absolutely. So, in general, student senators selected priorities for accessing resources with general list of top areas. Wi-Fi, specific materials, electronic devices such as tablets or desktops and notebooks, human resources such as staff, facility spaces such as gymnasiums, learning commons, etc. During the consultation, student senators indicated that Wi-Fi, access to counselors and facility spaces, or learning were resources that range from satisfaction. This is kind of a repeat. If there are any questions, I'm here, but that's pretty much a general summary of how our students are feeling at this current time.
Trustees, are there any questions that you would like to ask Student Trustee Colton? Student Trustee Colton, we look forward to joining you on Friday for the Student Trustee meeting, the virtual meeting, and we thank you very much for your report.
Thank you. I look very forward to it and hope all of you can join.
Thank you. Trustees, we are now going to move to, okay, let me just get my papers here, excuse me. 1401 is a report to the board from private session May 13th. At its Committee of the Whole meeting in private session May 13th, 2020, one personnel matter was discussed and one recommendation was brought forward to the board. And I'm going to add two names here. If you object, let me know. I have a motion moved by Trustee Danaher, seconded by Trustee Jacobs, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve Resolution PS 2020, May 13th, 002, carried in Committee of the Whole private session under Agenda Item E1, May 13th, 2020. Please cast the ballot.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you very much. We are now moving to, let me think now here, we're finished 17 information items. We are now moving into private session. So I have a motion moved by Vice Chair McPherson, seconded by Trustee McCray, that the Upper Canada District School Board move into a Committee of the Whole, May 27th, 2020 at 8:24 p.m. Please cast your ballot.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
I have a second motion moved by trustee Swan and seconded by trustee Danaher